Hey, I'm Josh Hawkins, and this is episode 73 of Opening Up the Gospels. Since episode 61, we've been looking at a period of Jesus' ministry I've called the Middle Galilean Ministry, a short period of perhaps only a couple of months that takes place in the spring of 28 AD. We saw both Jesus' miracles and teaching increase in scope and magnitude. In that short span, we saw him raise two people from the dead, we saw him teach the Sermon on the Mount, and we saw the disciples be sent out with power to preach the message of repentance and the coming day of the Lord to the towns in Galilee. Now, as I've mentioned before, these divisions of Jesus' ministry are all functional. You can break it up in many different ways, but it's just the way that I've chosen to do it. For more of an overview of these periods, you can go back and watch episodes 40 and 53, but I'll do a quick little review here. As we saw in the last episode, the Middle Galilean ministry ends with the sending of the 12. And now the Late Galilean period we'll see begins with the feeding of the 5,000, which, as I've mentioned in past episodes, is one of the most significant events in the Gospels that help us to form a general chronology, because all four Gospels mention it. We still have two more periods left to cover, the late Perean and Judean period, and then Passion Week. As I said back in episode 53, these first three periods, the early Judean, the early Galilean, and the middle Galilean, they all fit in the first year of Jesus' public ministry, between the first Passover in John 2 in 27 and then the second Passover of John 6 in 28. The Middle Galilean period lasted several months and stretched through the spring of 28. And now we'll approach this middle Passover of Jesus' ministry and go through about 6 months of events through about the fall of 28 AD. This is the Late Galilean ministry. Let's take a quick look at some of the themes we'll see in this Late Galilean period. If I were to label this section of Jesus' ministry with one word, it would be transition. This 6-month period is so dramatic for Jesus and for the disciples and for everyone he comes into contact with. In so many ways, this period is where everything begins to change, and it really forms the pivot point of the gospel story. Another thing we'll see is how Jesus' miracles explode on a whole different order than they have before. Of course, we've seen some pretty dramatic things already from the beginning of his early Galilean ministry, and then even in the last period with the raising of the two dead people and the calming of the storm. But the miracles in this stage really go past all of that. We're going to see Jesus' sovereignty over creation highlighted in a very particular way. A third thing we'll see is how the crowds grow even more and follow Jesus almost constantly throughout this period. We've looked at scenes where the crowds press about Jesus and are prodding and poking him for his attention, but in the late Galilean period, they're relentless. Fourth, and this is a big one, we see Jesus' identity affirmed by the disciples 3 distinct times. This is so important because the circumstances during this period bring up that question of his identity in the minds of the disciples like it was never brought up before. Jesus' question, "Who do you say that I am?" is such a defining moment during this period. Let's make this personal for a second. Almost always in our lives, the way the Lord arranges our circumstances is unto the larger question of causing us to learn something about who Jesus is. In other words, when our normal circumstances are disrupted, whether that's through lots of blessing or difficult problems, it's ultimately not really about the circumstances. I mean, to us, maybe it is, but from God's vantage point, the disruption is about his relationship with us. He wants to confront us and press something about himself onto our hearts. So, for example, if we're in a season of financial lack, that probably isn't accidental. He's pressing the question upon us of who he is as our provider. Or if we're experiencing relational rejection, he's pressing the question on our hearts, am I really your portion and your great reward? Now, we respond and typically say, well, why don't you let everyone like me? And he says, well, I like you. I want you to have me as your portion. The culmination of all of this is at the end of the age when all sorts of disruption is going to be happening. The point of all of that is to bring the earth into a confrontation with the identity of Jesus. So similarly here in this late Galilean period, this is what we're going to see going on. In this period, there's dramatic moments of glory and dramatic moments of severe testing, and all of it was to press upon the hearts of the disciples and the multitudes the question of who Jesus truly was to them. Well, the fifth theme that we're going to see in this period is that of Jesus' suffering. Though there were times in the past where he alluded to his death, 2 times during this period, Jesus will explicitly reveal what is going to happen to him at the hands of the Jewish authorities. He was doing this to prepare the 12 for what was ahead. These predictions, along with the questions of his identity, were all designed to incorporate suffering into their paradigm of his identity as the King of Israel, the Christ, and the Lord of glory himself. And the final theme of this period that we're going to look at more closely is at the close of the Galilean ministry. Following the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus pronounces judgment upon Galilee and actively avoids the crowds there. It would have been a really scary time, actually, to be a Galilean. Let's look at how the Gospels narrate this portion of Jesus' ministry. Unlike in some of the past periods we've looked at, in this period, the synoptic Gospels parallel each other pretty closely in terms of the chronological order of events. Most of the time, Mark and Luke will parallel one another, but Matthew's kind of all over the place. But in this period, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all parallel one another, which makes it pretty easy to get a clear picture of what's going on. However, though Luke agrees chronologically with all the other authors, he doesn't really include much information about this section. However, Matthew gives nearly 4 chapters to the events that Luke summarizes in just 43 verses. In this period, we're also going to see some details from Mark's Gospel that are absent in Matthew and Luke. This shows us again how complementary the Gospels are to one another. And John, though he's mostly narrating events in Jerusalem and Judea, he does narrate events in this section of Jesus' ministry. Not just the feeding of the 5,000, but the few days immediately following it as well. Remember, John has not been narrating anything since the unnamed feast back in John 5, which we looked at all the way back in episode 55. Let's look at a quick breakdown of where this period is in each of the Gospels. In Matthew, we see this period narrated in Matthew 14:1 through 17:21. Mark is Mark 6:14 through 9:50. Luke is just 9:7 through 9:50, just 43 verses. And John is John 6:5 through John 6:71. Well, let's look at our timeline and briefly take a look at the events of this period. First, we'll begin with the feeding of the 5,000, which is narrated in Matthew 14, Mark 6, Luke 9, and John 6. Then miracles on the Sea of Galilee, which is when Jesus walks on the water and then does healings in Gennesaret. And then Jesus' conflict with the Pharisees and the scribes from Jerusalem. Then the famous eat my flesh, drink my blood sermon at the synagogue in Capernaum, where a larger group of his disciples turn away from him. And then Jesus' journey away from Galilee towards Tyre and Sidon, where he meets a Gentile woman there. And then a healing of a huge crowd in the Decapolis. And then the healing of a mute and a deaf man in the Decapolis. And then the feeding of the 4,000 in the Decapolis. Then Jesus has returned to Galilee where he meets with some Pharisees again. And then Jesus talking about the leaven of the Pharisees on the boat. And then Jesus healing the blind man in Bethsaida. And then the really important event on the way to Caesarea Philippi, the confession of Jesus as the Christ. And then immediately after the confession, Jesus predicts his suffering and gives instructions for discipleship. And then the transfiguration. And this is the turning point where all his Galilean ministry is behind him. And finally, the healing of the boy. In the next episode, we'll begin to look at the feeding of the 5,000. As I've mentioned many times before, it's one of the most significant events in the Gospels. As always, you can find all the other episodes in the series on my website, www.joshuahawkins.com/Gospels. I hope you come back next time. God bless you.